Hey everyone, welcome to Mythology Explained. Today we're going to be talking about Christopher Nolan's upcoming adaptation of the Odyssey, but not in the way that I've already talked about it. In some of my previous videos on the topic, I covered some of the major controversies surrounding the film. In particular, the casting, where I highlighted the apparent lack of Greek presence in a film adapting one of the most important Greek stories ever written. I also touched on the rumors surrounding Elliot Page and Achilles, and I've talked about how strange it feels to adapt a story so deeply concerned with homecoming, identity, and cultural belonging, while seemingly treating Greekness as something that can mostly be supplied by sets, costumes, ships, and scenery. But over the last few days, I've noticed a different controversy starting to take shape around Nolan's Odyssey. One that's even more complicated, because this time, the argument isn't just about who's playing Odysseus, or Helen, or Achilles. It's about which version of the Odyssey modern audiences should be given. In this case, Christopher Nolan has been drawing on Emily Wilson's 2017 translation of the Odyssey, a translation that has become one of the most talked about, debated, and criticized English versions of Homer in recent memory. A lot of people online are now acting as if this means Nolan's movie is somehow based on a woke rewrite of Homer. And on the other side, you have people saying that the criticisms are ridiculous because Emily Wilson's translation is actually more faithful than the older male translations. And as usual, the internet has produced a very interesting literary debate into two completely useless extremes. Either Emily Wilson is destroying Western civilization, or Emily Wilson is simply giving us the pure, unfiltered Homer that everyone else was too biased to translate properly. And on a personal level, I don't think either of those positions is really true. Today I want to slow things down and take a look at what the Odyssey is, why translation matters so much, what Emily Wilson actually did differently, and whether the criticisms of her translation have any merit. So, what is the Odyssey? Simply put, it's one of the foundational works of ancient Greek literature. It's traditionally attributed to Homer, the same figure associated with the Iliad, and it tells the story of Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, trying to return home after the Trojan War. Britannica describes it as an epic poem in 24 books, centered on Odysseus' long journey back to Ithaca after Troy, with the action of the poem itself covering only the final stretch of that journey. And this is important because the Odyssey isn't just a fantasy adventure where a man fights monsters. That's part of it, of course, but at its core, the Odyssey is a poem about homecoming. The Greek word often associated with this is nostos, meaning return or homecoming. Odysseus isn't simply trying to survive. He's trying to get back to his house, his wife, his son, his kingdom, his name, and his place in the world. He's trying to become Odysseus again. And that's what makes the story so powerful. Because by the time Odysseus finally reaches Ithaca, the journey isn't over. Geographically, he's home, but emotionally, socially, and politically, he still has to reclaim that home. His palace has been overrun by suitors, his wife Penelope is under immense pressure to remarry, his son Telemachus has grown up without him, and Odysseus has to return not as a glorious warrior charging through the gates, but in disguise as a beggar, testing the loyalty of the people around him before finally revealing himself. The story touches on identity, memory, and loyalty. It's about whether a man who has been gone for 20 years can ever truly return to the life he left behind. And one of the biggest problems here is that almost none of us are encountering the poem directly, but relying on the translations of others. Most of us do not read Homeric Greek, and that means the version of Odysseus we know, the tone, the morality, the violence, the grandeur, the ugliness, the beauty, is filtered through another person's choices. And this is where the translation debate begins. In my opinion, there is no single perfect English Odyssey, no final gold standard that everyone agrees is simply Homer in English. Instead, there are different translations that do different things. Some are more literal, some more poetic, others are more readable, and others more archaic. Some try to preserve the feeling of ancient epic grandeur, others try to make the story move quickly for a modern reader. And because ancient Greek doesn't map perfectly onto modern English, every translator has to choose what kind of Odyssey they are creating. Among modern English readers, several translations tend to come up again and again. There is E.V. Rieu's prose translation from 1946, which is clear, accessible, and helped make the Odyssey readable for a broad Penguin Classics audience. There is Robert Fitzgerald's 1961 version, elegant and literary. There is Richmond Lattimore's 1965 translation, often valued by students because it stays closer to the structure and wording of the Greek, and there is Robert Fagel's 1996 version, probably one of the most popular modern verse translations, full of energy, grandeur, and forward momentum. Britannica lists Fitzgerald, Lattimore, Allen, Mandelbaum, and Fagles among the notable 20th century English translations. And then in 2017, Emily Wilson published her translation, which immediately stood out for several reasons. Firstly, because she was the first woman to publish a complete English translation of the Odyssey. Secondly, because her translation used clear, contemporary English. And thirdly, because she kept the poem in verse, using iambic pentameter, and made a formal commitment to matching Homer line for line. A review in the Spencer Review notes that Wilson's version has the same number of lines as the original, and uses unrhymed iambic pentameter as an English equivalent for Homer's dactylic hexameter. One of the laziest criticisms you hear is that Wilson just turned the Odyssey into plain prose or simplified modern language. But that's not really fair because her translation is formally disciplined. It is not a novelization. It's a verse translation by a serious classicist who clearly knows the text extremely well. But her style is also very different from what we're used to. Fagles begins with something like "the man of twists and turns," whereas Wilson begins with "tell me about a complicated man." And that one phrase basically explains the entire controversy. Because complicated is brilliant in one sense, immediately telling a modern reader that Odysseus is not simply a noble hero. He's layered, he's clever, he's damaged, he is morally difficult. He is not Achilles. He isn't a straightforward warrior of brute strength and shining glory. He's a strategist, a liar, a survivor, a manipulator, a husband, a king, a pirate, and a man trying to get home. But the use of complicated also feels extremely modern. It sounds almost psychological, like someone describing their emotionally unavailable ex. And that's why some readers love it, while others feel that something epic has been lost. And the Greek word being translated there, polytropos, is already difficult. It carries ideas of many turns, many ways, adaptability, wandering, cunning, and complexity. So Wilson isn't inventing the idea that Odysseus is complicated. That ambiguity is already in the Greek. The question is whether complicated captures that ambiguity or narrows it too much. And that is basically the entire Emily Wilson debate in miniature. A lot of her choices reveal something real in the poem, but sometimes they also push the reader toward one particular interpretation, and that shouldn't necessarily be the goal. The most famous example is slavery. Older translations often use words like maids, servants, or housekeepers for enslaved women in Odysseus's household, whereas Wilson is much more willing to call them slaves. And on this point, I think the defense of Wilson is very strong. Ancient Ithaca, as depicted in the poem, is a slave-holding society. If a translation softens that into maid or servant, modern readers may imagine voluntary employment rather than human ownership. Wilson's defenders argue that she is not adding modern politics to the poem here, but instead just refusing to hide something that was already there. And I don't disagree with that defense. If Odysseus owns people, then a translation shouldn't protect him from that fact. And in that sense, Wilson arguably makes the ancient world feel more alien, not less. She refuses to let us pretend that Homeric society was just a heroic adventure landscape with nicer language. But the criticism begins when that same interpretive approach becomes too forceful. Because while Wilson is often praised for naming slavery directly, some scholars and reviewers have pointed out that she can also flatten distinctions in the Greek. Not every household role or dependent figure operates in exactly the same way, and when too many different statuses are compressed into one modern category, some of the social complexity of Homer's world can disappear. Wilson's translation may be morally clearer, but Homer himself isn't always morally clear. A balanced review in Bryn Mawr Classical Review makes almost exactly this point. It praises Wilson's translation as lively and powerful, but also argues that her forceful interpretation can make the poem feel less open-ended. The reviewer specifically notes that complicated brings out a negative side of Odysseus's ambiguity, while also doing some of the interpretive work that the original leaves to the audience. And to me, that is the real issue, that her translation doesn't feel completely neutral. And this is something Wilson herself had since argued. Translators make choices. Male translators make choices. Female translators make choices. Conservative translators make choices. Progressive translators make choices. And a translator who uses grand, archaic language is making a choice. The fantasy isn't that Emily Wilson has a perspective, it's that older translations somehow did not. Some people are acting as if the older male translations were just Homer himself speaking directly through pure, unbiased English, and then Emily Wilson came along and infected the text with ideology. But that's not how translation works. Older translators also brought their own assumptions. Sometimes they softened slavery, sometimes they intensified sexual shame, sometimes they made Odysseus more noble or more heroic or more grandly masculine than the Greek necessarily demands. These were likely literary and cultural decisions. So when Wilson removes certain loaded insults from scenes involving women, that may not be her censoring Homer. It may be her removing things that earlier translators added. One of the clearest examples is the killing of the enslaved women near the end of the poem. Some older translations make these women sound sexually degraded or morally disgusting, in ways that are not necessarily present in the Greek. Wilson pushes back against that. She wants the reader to feel the brutality of what happens to them, rather than casually accepting their deaths as righteous punishment. And this does feel like a legitimate translation goal, but here's where the other side has a point. Wilson's version doesn't just reveal brutality, it can sometimes guide the reader very strongly toward a modern moral response. It makes certain scenes feel more disturbing, more unjust, or more implicated in structures of gender and power. And I think we all need to be honest about what's happening. Wilson may be making legitimate scholarly choices, but I do think there is a point where the defense of her translation becomes a little intellectually slippery. Wilson's Odyssey isn't just Homer but clearer. It's Homer filtered through a translator who is deeply interested in gender, class, slavery, power, hierarchy, and the moral discomfort of ancient epic. And while that doesn't make it fake, it certainly does make it interpretive. The same Bryn Mawr Classical Review discussion of Wilson's choices says that she avoids repetition in ways that make the story smoother and more modern, but that this also changes the reader's relationship to a poem that depends heavily on repetition, formula, and interpretation. The same review ultimately calls the translation an amazing achievement, while still warning that it can be less open-ended than the original, and that nuance is exactly what gets lost online. So, what kind of Homer does Emily Wilson give us? The answer is that she gives us a Homer that is fast, clear, accessible, morally sharp, and deeply attentive to power. And while for some readers that may feel like a revelation, for others it feels like the poem has been pulled too firmly into the present. This is also why the Nolan connection matters. Adapting the Odyssey into a blockbuster film is already almost impossible. You have to decide what kind of story you're telling. Is this an ancient epic, a psychological survival story, a brutal home invasion revenge story? The poem can be all of those things, but a film cannot emphasize everything equally. So if Nolan is leaning heavily on Wilson's translation, then the argument can be made that he may also be inheriting some of Wilson's priorities. Directness, moral discomfort, stripped-down grandeur, contemporary speech, and a more skeptical view of Odysseus as a hero. And while this could be fascinating, it could also create problems. Because the Odyssey depends on strangeness. It's not supposed to feel exactly like our world. It comes from an ancient heroic culture with values that are often alien, violent, hierarchical, patriarchal, and morally disturbing. And if you modernize too much, you risk making the poem feel like a contemporary drama wearing Bronze Age clothing. And that is already one of my concerns with the film. From the trailer and the dialogue people have been discussing, there's a danger that Nolan's Odyssey could end up feeling oddly modern in the wrong places. Not modern in the sense of accessible, because accessibility is fine, but modern in the sense that the characters may feel less like mythic figures from an ancient world, and more like contemporary prestige drama characters dropped into ships and armor. That doesn't make it Emily Wilson's fault, but if her translation is one of the major reference points, it becomes part of the conversation. Britannica notes that the Odyssey was intended for oral performance and likely transmitted through generations of oral poets before being written down. It also gives the poem as 12,109 lines in dactylic hexameter. And don't get it twisted here, there's no perfect translation. It doesn't exist. Lattimore may feel closer to the Greek structure, but less natural to a modern reader. Fagles may sound grand and exciting, but sometimes more inflated. Fitzgerald may be beautiful, but more literary in a mid-century English way. And Wilson may be fast, clear, and ethically alert, but sometimes more interpretively forceful. But none of them is simply the real Odyssey. They are all arguments about what the Odyssey should become in English. And again, that brings us back to Nolan, because he's the one who has chosen to use Emily Wilson's translation. And if that translation really is part of the DNA of the film, then the translation debate becomes part of the adaptation debate, because every choice we have seen so far seems to raise the same basic question. What kind of Odyssey are we actually getting? And that is why I think the problem just got worse, because now we are not just asking whether the armor looks right, or whether Matt Damon looks like Odysseus, that felt ridiculous to say, or whether the cast reflects the Greek world. We are asking whose Homer this actually is. Is it Homer through ancient oral poetry, Homer through centuries of English translators, Homer through Emily Wilson's modern moral clarity, or some strange combination of all of them? And maybe that's unavoidable. Every generation rewrites the Odyssey in some way. Every translation is a new version. But that does not mean all choices are equal, and it doesn't mean audiences are wrong to ask what has been gained, what has been clarified, what has been softened, and what has been lost, because the Odyssey has survived for nearly 3,000 years precisely because it can be retold. But the danger is that in making it speak to us, we may make it sound too much like us. Anyway, that's it for today's video. What do you think? Is Emily Wilson's translation a brilliant modern version of Homer, or does it take too many creative liberties? And does Nolan leaning on that translation make you more excited for his Odyssey or more worried? Let me know down in the comment section below, and as always, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more Mythology Explained.